Hello, AP students. This is Mrs. Vastelica, and this presentation is about England from AD 449 to 1485. We're really going to be talking about the Old English and medieval periods in England because we're going to be reading Beowulf and eventually the Canterbury Tales. There are a few essential questions I want you to consider as you take notes on this presentation. What is the relationship between literature and place? How does literature shape or reflect society? And what's the relationship of writer to tradition? These are some of the questions that we're going to be considering as we talk about this portion of English history. Now, you may or may not know what you're looking at here. This is a map of England right here. This is Scotland here. This is Wales, Northern Ireland, and Ireland. Ireland is a separate country from England and the UK today, but I wanted to show you this map because we're going to be talking about how the language we speak today here in the United States developed from this little island in the Atlantic. So let's start by talking about the languages that were brought to England from the mainland continent of Europe. The Celts, not the Celts, but the Celts invaded about 500 years BC, before Christ. The Celts brought Gaelic, which is still spoken today in Ireland and in Wales, which descends from the Celts' original language. So the Celts were a people with their own culture and their own language, and they were considered the first inhabitants of the English Isles. Then came the Romans in about 55 BC, and then they had a second wave of invasion in 43 AD. You probably remember from world history that the Roman Empire spanned thousands of miles, and along with that, their language and culture. So Latin was another influence on language. Though the Celts were speaking their original language for many hundreds of years before the Romans arrived, the Romans bringing Latin eventually influenced the culture and the language in England. We also have the Anglo-Saxons. So there were warring tribes of people that the Romans were kind of always battling for territory. They both gained and lost. They gained from and lost territory to these groups of informally run people in Northern Europe. And the Anglo-Saxons and then the Scandinavians from 449 to 700 and 900 had various and multiple invasions, and they brought Germanic languages. So these are the portions of Northern Europe that are today Germany or the Netherlands or Scandinavian countries. Those languages also influenced English. Finally, the Normans, that was a region of France, what is today France. They were the last major invasion in 1066. They brought French with them. It's important to know these things, these four various invasions, because you can still today see echoes of these languages in our modern English language. So, as you can imagine, if you're living in England or if you're living in Ireland at this time, there are many invasions going on. St. Augustine and the Christians brought not only Latin, but the Christian religion with them. Before the Christians arrived, quote-unquote pagan, that was the Christian term, or non-Christians, was the belief system of the people of England. Early influence of the Bible and Latin can be found in Beowulf, one of the first texts that we're going to be reading, and actually the first text to be recorded in English, written down in English. There were many tensions, as you can imagine, between the quote-unquote pagan beliefs already in the British Isles and the Christian ideas. So as you read Beowulf, look for some of the reflections of those Christian ideals in what was otherwise a quote-unquote pagan or polytheistic society. This map here gives you a good idea of where the people were invading from and why the first story written in English is actually about this part of the world. Beowulf travels from Geatland to the land of the Danes, and that is these portions of Northern Europe here. So remember I said there were multiple Roman invasions. Eventually the Roman Empire started to crumble, and so they pulled out of the British Isles, and these Germanic tribes invaded. The Danes after the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes. Alfred the Great is considered England's first king. He stopped the Danish invasion in 871 from conquering the rest of the island. The last successful invasion, as I mentioned before, was by the French, Normans, and William the Conqueror. So keep in mind that England, as a region, was constantly being invaded by groups of people, and they all left their imprint on the language and the culture. When we eventually get to the Canterbury Tales, you'll need to recall much of what you already know about the feudal era. Of course, in this graphic, you see the king up top, you see the nobles and the knights in service of the king, and the peasants, who were the majority of the people, doing all of the service to those upper classes. The Normans, the ones from France, really brought this structure from France over to England. It lasted until about 1215 with the signing of the Magna Carta, which ended up limiting the powers of the king and brought in a parliamentary system, which we see reflected in our government today in the United States with our, three-tiered system of the judicial branch, the executive branch, and the legislative branch. So we owe much of our political history as well as our language history to this country. Now, during the feudal era, the king's powers began to be questioned. The kings Edward II and Richard II were deposed and both assassinated. At the same time, the Black Plague is killing approximately 1/3 of the English population, a huge amount of people. This is an image you may have seen before. This is what the doctors would wear to supposedly protect themselves from the plague. And this is just a representation of the huge civil wars that were going on for over 30 years in England. When Henry VII comes to power and unifies England, it marks the beginning of a time of peace and prosperity, eventually known as the Renaissance. And that, in the second semester of this school year, will be when we start talking about Renaissance poets, most famously William Shakespeare. So let's consider about how England really went from being a many-tribe nation to one nation. Those successive waves of invasion influenced language, religion, government, and culture. The Normans, bringing with them French language and the system of society, feudalism. And after a great time of great change and upheaval, eventually there was one language, but that language was influenced by the Celts, the original settlers, the Romans with Latin, the Germanic tribes, which literally spoke languages that eventually evolved into Germany, which is why we call them Germanic, and the Normans, who brought French. So English, our modern English, is a mixture of all of these languages. Now, let's consider that essential question. What's the relationship between literature and place? So the time of Beowulf, they considered the sea as a threat, and they thought of their island geography, living on an island, as being somewhat protected from an untamable threat. That's why you'll find in The Seafarer, The Wanderer, other poems like Beowulf, they focus on exile and separation, because those were the themes that the people of the day dealt with. Christian monks, who again were new, and they were the only literate people, the Celts, though of course had a spoken language, did not have as complex a written language as the Christian monks. They wrote down these poems, The Seafarer, Beowulf, and they really tried to find parallels between the Christian stories, like Adam and Eve, and these otherwise pagan stories. Sea Road and Mead Hall, these are the kind of archaic structures and archaic terminology that you'll see in Beowulf. Of course, the Sea Road is the ocean. The Mead Hall is the warm gathering place that protected them from the rather harsh outside elements. These are important locations in Beowulf, an epic poem, and which is one of the first texts to be written in Old English. We're going to talk more about Old English. It is not how Shakespeare wrote. Old English is actually more like a German language than it is like the English we speak today. So let's also consider, how does literature shape and reflect society itself? Well, people started recording for the first time things like histories, like Beattie's History of the English Church and its People. Geoffrey Chaucer, whom we'll be looking at very closely, wrote the Canterbury Tales, which is one of the first and certainly one of the most famous satires ever written in the English language. He both illustrated and commented on the changing social structure in the Middle Ages. According to some critics, Chaucer invented English poetry as we know it, and he really captured what it was like to be in England at this time of major change. It's just one example of how literature of a time period reflected that period's evolution and change. If you look up here, here's our buddy Beowulf, and there's Geoffrey Chaucer. The epic poem Beowulf that we're going to start reading very soon, it really shows the dramatic rise and fall of the hero. It's a very classic tale, good versus evil. But the poet also focuses on the lamenting of the death of the hero. So the sadness and the anguish felt by the people when their great hero is lost. Chaucer, on the other hand, was much more critical of what he was seeing in society. Through personal stories of his pilgrims in the Canterbury Tales, he talks about corruption of the church, the rise of the middle class. He shows a real evolution in what the written language did over really only 400 or 500 years. A couple texts that we're not going to be able to get to, Morte d'Arthur and Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, are those classic tales of Arthurian legend of knights and ladies. And Chaucer had read these stories and did know this classic tradition. And he both uses that as a story and he criticizes it in many ways. He also established iambic pentameter, which you know from your study of Shakespeare in the past, which was rediscovered during the Renaissance. So when we look at Beowulf and we look at Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, we're looking at fundamental texts that have influenced the English language for many hundreds of years. So thank you for listening to, viewing these notes, and taking the notes of your own. I hope now you have some understanding of both the major events and the people of the Old English and medieval periods.